Welcome to Forbidden Planet TV. I'm Andrew Sumner, and today I'm privileged to be joined by one of our favourite authors at Forbidden Planet, Sebastien de Castell. How are you, mate?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Andrew.
Oh, mate, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. We're big fans, as you know, of the Greatcoat series and of the Spellslinger series, and we're here to talk about not one but two of the latest instalments in the Spellslinger series, because we have The Way of the Argosy hitting Forbidden Planet shelves on the 14th of November in its paperback form, and then also The Fall of the Argosy, which is book 8, landing on the same day in its hardcover form. So, Sebastien, congratulations on these two latest in this epic series. What can you tell me about the two books?
Well, they both they're interesting books because if someone hasn't read Spellslinger at all, they can actually start with Way of the Argosy, because and in fact you can read either Spellslinger and the Argosy books in that order or in reverse order, and it still works, because the Argosy books really deal with Farius Parfax, who's a character that we meet ultimately in the Spellslinger series when she's much older, and she's this very quite sort of wise and mischievous kind of mentor. And in the Argosy books, we get to see what she was like before that, how she became an Argosy. And of course, the Argosy are these kind of strange, kind of almost cowboy philosophers, these wandering gambler tricksters who, in a world that's kind of very dominated by magic and who's got the most magic, the Argosy are all about looking at those very human talents that we all have, music and dance and swagger and gambling and martial arts, and trying to take those to such a degree, to develop them to such a degree that they can actually kind of withstand all of these kind of fairly horrible mages that run roughshod over the entire continent.
Yeah.
So that's the essence of what those books are about. And the first book, Way of the Argosy, is where we meet Farius as a young refugee who's on the run, basically from a posse of war mages, and she has no power, no money, no friends, but she's determined to fight back. And along the way, she meets one of the Argosy, a guy named Durrell Brown, who offers to teach her the tricks and techniques of staying alive, but the price might be more than she's willing to pay.
Right on. And how, without giving too much away, how can, because it's always tricky when you're talking about a paperback release and a hardcover release, because I want to talk about both, but I don't want to. We don't want to reveal too much about The Way of the Argosy. So what can you tell me about The Fall of the Argosy?
Well, Fall of the Argosy deals with an event that is mentioned at one point in the second Spellslinger book, Shadow Black, that people ask me about all the time. Because in Shadow Black, we meet another Argosy. The second Spellslinger book is the first time that Kellen, who's the main character of that series, who's a young man from this very magical culture who thinks magic is all important and all of that, and he meets Farius, who sort of shows him this other path. But in the second book is the first time he meets another Argosy who's completely different from Farius, who calls herself the Way of Thorns and Roses, or the Path of Thorns and Roses. And he doesn't even know that Argosy give themselves these kinds of names at that point. And Rosie, as Farius insists on calling her, even though that drives the Path of Thorns and Roses crazy, is completely different from Farius. She's more like what we think of as a Jedi. She's a very sort of focused and disciplined, and she's all about like mastering things carefully, whereas Farius is more like this swaggering gambler, hard drinking gambler, walks into a situation seemingly with no plan. And so their dynamic, which is quite hostile, we don't know sort of where that comes from. And so Fall of the Argosy is about something called the Red Scream, which is a kind of mystical plague that the two of them, which is where the two of them meet and develop their relationship. And so, without spoiling anything, that's sort of the backdrop that we get to explore in that book.
Brilliant, mate. And can we talk a little bit about the development of this universe and the previous universe of your Greatcoat series? For you, how do you step into those worlds? Are you character first? Are you universe first? What's your process?
Well, they actually first take place in the same universe.
Yeah.
Because the events of Spellslinger and the Argosi books take place on a different continent from the Greatcoats, but there actually is a relationship between the Greatcoats and the Argosi, which is something I'm very, very keen to kind of delve into in later books. But I've got sort of this other Greatcoat series coming that I have to do first. But in terms of process, I think that I very much start with character in a situation. I sort of ask myself, what would it be like to be this person? So in the case of Traitor's Blade, it was, what would it be like to have, spent your whole life trying to achieve this sort of heroic ideal based on these principles of decency and compassion and justice, and discover that none of those principles seem to work. Right? Like, what would you do if you become the very thing you'd hoped, you'd aspired to, only to discover that those things were basically pointless in the culture in which you live? What would you do next? In the same way, in the case of Spellslinger, it's just, for me, it was, we always look at, books and series like Harry Potter, where, the question is, wouldn't it be fantastic if, despite thinking you're just this dull, ordinary, regular person, it turns out that you're secretly, the chosen one with this amazing destiny and these parents who loved you more than anyone else and these powers beyond anyone else's. I wanted to go the other way with Spellslinger and go, well, what would it be like if you discovered that you were part of this magical society and your parents were these powerful mages and your sister was a powerful mage and you were nothing, like your powers disappeared? Because for me, that's both it's more dramatically in tune with my interests, but it also more closely reflects what it was like for me to be a teenager. So I always start from that perspective of, what would it be like to be this character in this kind of very difficult situation?
Sure. Okay. That's very interesting. Can we look back to your first Greatcoat novel, Traitor's Blade? So how long did it take you? How long did it take you to actually develop that book? Because you're well into your universe now. But what was your journey to get to that point, and what was your inspiration, your jumping on point?
So I'm going to say something that's going to sound absolutely terrible, and I'll try to give it the context so it won't sound so terrible. The first draft of Traitor's Blade was written in 3 days in 2000. There's a thing that happens every year called the 3-day novel writing contest. I hadn't written anything for I don't know, must have been almost 9 years. I wasn't writing at that point. I hadn't thought of myself as becoming a novelist. But this 3-day novel writing contest came up, and I thought, what the hell? I'll just sit down. I had no plan. Usually, people walk in with pretty big outlines, and they get up, they start writing at 12:01, and I was. I had nothing, and I got up at like 7 a.m, and I wasn't even sure what book I was going to write. And then I just wrote nonstop for 3 days, and that became the first draft of a book called Three of Traitors, which later became Traitor's Blade. But the truth was, I spent about 5 years kind of every time I went running. I'm a terrible runner. I'm just not very good at it. So I need to entertain myself while I'm running. And so I was sort of telling myself this story in the back of my mind about these kind of characters who, as I mentioned, have kind of lost everything. They thought that they were the great sort of heroic judges, wandering from town to town, hearing cases and bringing justice to the country. And then it turns out that they were sort of, everybody hated them, and they were disbanded, and the king who brought them together was killed. And so that's kind of, so I probably, in a sense, spent 5 years thinking about it, 3 days writing a draft. And then I spent 6 years writing the second draft. So just in case anyone's feeling like, I should be writing novels in 3 days. You should be writing novels in 3 days, but then you have to take some time to revise them. But in terms of the inspirations, there were two kind of key inspirations for me, I think, maybe three. The one was this whole idea of the greatcoat itself, like this coat that was a kind of armor and had all these tools and tricks and traps, and that you could kind of survive in the wild with, or you could survive a duel, while wearing, came because my elder brother John, for a Christmas birthday present, I think, once bought me an actual greatcoat. And like an overcoat type. And I was like, what the hell is this? Like, why would I want this thing? But when I was working as an actor, I was a really terrible actor. I was always on night shoots, because if you're really bad, the parts that you get are always on night shoots. And so I would always have this coat with me, because you could fit everything in it. You could fit like hardback books in it if you wanted. You know what I mean? So you'd be in costume thing on, and then you're set. And I was like, oh, this would be really great. Like, I should have one of these so you could go into the wilds and survive, you know? So part of it was that notion of the coat. Part of it came from what's called the Justice's Itinerant, which was a 12th century English phenomenon, because of course, you know, when we think of the court used to refer to the king's court, and it was in one place. You didn't have courts all over the country. And so in order to bring the king's laws, you had to have these justices who went on circuits, which is where the American term circuit court judge comes from, and circuit courts, in fact. So that was the second part. And the third part, the sort of the underlying pain of the great coats, I think, was oddly enough from the 2004 American election. Of all things, I'm Canadian, you're British, so for us, you know, American politics are like this, you know, entertainment show that we watch that's periodically terrifying when we remember it. And it had to do with John Kerry, who, regardless of where one sits politically, had been this guy who had volunteered to go to fight in Vietnam, even though he was against the war. He received medals for valor. He clearly thought he had done all the right things. And somehow in that election, he became the sort of cowardly traitor. And George W. Bush, who, regardless of whether you love the guy or not, he was in the Texas Air National Guard. He didn't have to go over and fight himself. And so that notion of someone who really thought that they had done the right thing, only to discover that half the country despises them, that sort of made me go, you know, that's what I want for my swashbuckling heroes.
Yeah. So it's so rich, so fascinating to hear you talk about that. Touching upon your personal history as an actor and your interaction with the swashbuckling form, you were a fight choreographer for a while, isn't that right, Sebastien? I'm sure I read that once.
I did. I spent a couple of years choreographing sword fights for the theater. It's an extravagant lifestyle. The money, Andrew, the money. I started out fencing. I got quite into fencing for a while, fairly late relative to most people. But I got very excited about it, and then did a little theatrical fencing, and then started doing fight choreography. And that, of course, kind of spawned a certain love for the narrative side of swordplay.
Yeah.
So that kind of became a core element, I think, of the way, especially Trader's Blade unfolds. With it, you know, because one of the challenges of fantasy novels is that part of the appeal of fantasy novels are things like battles and sword fights. You know, when we imagine reading a fantasy novel, often it's things like that we love. But when you actually read a sword fight, it can be dull as doornails. You know, you can be sitting there, and so what I had as a bit of an advantage, or certainly it helped me, was I knew from watching theater audiences that if the sword fight is unintelligible, and if the sword fight is just about the swords movement, then it becomes very boring, because it's like somebody plumbing. They can be very good with the tools, but that's all you're watching. And so you have to inject stakes and character and sort of personality into the movements. Why does this person fight this way? And what did that move mean, where they suddenly sort of tried to be deceptive here and come around on the other side? Is that maybe a sign of their character? And so that allowed me to kind of try to craft these scenes in which there's a great deal of swordplay in such a way that it feels like a dialogue between characters rather than just sort of a martial arts performance.
I think that's so fascinating and so well said. And I think it's one of the great triumphs of your writing is that ability to turn something that's very kinetic and visual into a form that you can actually read and enjoy. Because there are people who, for me, are very well identified with the swashbuckling form in print. And it might be because I'm reading translations because I'm English. But for example, I don't think that Alexander Dumas does as good a job of doing that as you do, for example. So maybe it's different if you read them in French, which I can't do.
Well, it's a different form of writing, certainly, and I confess that I've always been more a fan of people like C.S. Forester with the Horatio Horn.
Absolutely wonderful. Yeah, my dad's favorite author, in fact. So I've read a ton of those books. They're beautifully detailed, aren't they?
They are, and they flow. And I think one of the things that I see, and I'm honestly, I'm really no expert on Dumas, who, thank heavens for Dumas, because he gave us so much. Without Dumas, we don't have Sabatini, who's one of my favorite authors as well. He was writing in the 1920s, 1930s, British Italian writer, and Scaramouche, for example, if anyone's looking for a kind of a really core swashbuckling book, Scaramouche, I think, is a really nice bridge between that sort of historical adventure style of Dumas and our own kind of more modern sensibilities, which are more informed, I think, around Errol Flynn and sort of the movies than they about the kind of textualization of swordplay and swashbuckling. So I'm with I certainly wouldn't dare to put myself on the same shelf with Dumas, but I agree with you that for a modern reader it can be quite tricky. I have the same problem if I try to read Don Quixote, for example, which is one of the greatest books of all time. But they're paced differently from the way that we tend to receive books now.
Yeah, I think that's very true. We could have a whole brilliant side conversation about this, because you've opened the door on an hour's worth of conversation about the Count of Monte Cristo, which I would love to have with you, and about the Musketeers book. But another time, back to your books. We've got The Way of the Argosi and The Fall of the Argosi, both available for pre-order from the links attached to this conversation. Here they are, right here, both available from these links. Sebastien, thanks so much for joining me, mate. It's really great to meet you.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. I hope we get to see each other in person soon.
We 1000% will. And on a closing swashbuckling note, top two movies, what would you recommend to anybody who's cold to the form, wants to see a great sword fight on screen? What would you say?
I'd say you have to watch these two movies. You have to watch them back to back. You can watch them in any order, but I'm going to suggest in this order, which is first The Duelists by Ridley Scott. First, when he was commissioning Bill Hobbs to be the fight choreographer, he said specifically, I don't want to see any of that Hollywood Errol Flynn crap on the screen. I want this to be ugly and dirty and brutish and realistic. And that's what you see in those fights. You see you get what it probably would have felt like to be in that situation. And also it's a fantastic story. It's I think I'm sorry, I'm losing the name of the author. What's his face? So I can't remember, but if you look it up, it's easy to find. But The Duelists, I think it's from 1977. The second one,
Harvey Keitel and Keith Carradine, great performances.
Yeah, Harvey Keitel. I mean, in a role you would never, think of before now, and yet I rewatched it the other day, and he's just devastating in it.
So good.
And then give yourself the privilege of probably rewatching, because almost the whole world's watched it, The Princess Bride, which was choreographed by Bob Anderson and a few people of his kind of ilk. And and Bob Anderson had been one of Errol Flynn's stunt doubles, amongst other things. And so I don't think you'll ever see a movie in which that particular style of swashbuckling swordplay is as well represented. For me, it's sort of the culmination of that. And what happens after that is we start getting into movies where they just try to make it faster and more cuts, and it doesn't work as well. But when you see Mandy Patinkin and Carrie Elwes, performing that fight that took them, 12 weeks or 14 weeks to learn, it's really wonderful. So The Duelists and Princess Bride, and then go by the Great Coat series 3 times.
Exactly. Beautiful choices, and I love in The Princess Bride a combination of fight choreography and conversation. I think that's what really makes that fight work, and the fact that that they've actually spent months learning how to do it it's the way they toss off those lines at the same time. Thanks so much, Sebastien. So once again, The Way of the Argosi and The Fall of the Argosi, available right here, right there in Sebastien's hands. Thanks so much for joining us, mate, and we'll see you soon when you can make it back to the UK.
Thank you, Andrew.
If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.